History remembers the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. It was a giant, a titan of trade that stretched its tentacles across the Indian Ocean. It sailed into the sunrise, chasing the scent of cloves and nutmeg. It built an empire of spice in Asia that poured unimaginable wealth into the counting houses of Amsterdam. The VOC was the celebrated child, the golden son of the Dutch Republic. Its name became synonymous with power, profit, and a global reach the world had never seen before. It was a story of success, a legend whispered in awe from the canals of Holland to the palaces of Java. But every family has more than one child. While the VOC basked in the eastern sun, another company was born to face the West. This was the Dutch West India Company, the WIC. It was the forgotten twin, the grittier sibling. Its destiny was not in the fragrant spice islands of the East, but in the turbulent waters of the Atlantic. It sailed toward the sunset, into a world dominated by the mighty Spanish and Portuguese empires. Where the VOC sought trade, the WIC was built for war. It was conceived in conflict, designed to pry open the closed fist of the Iberian powers and seize the riches of the New World. The two companies were like two sides of the Dutch soul. The VOC was the shrewd merchant, the master negotiator who built monopolies through contracts and cunning. It preferred a treaty to a battle, though it was not afraid to use force when necessary. The WIC, however, was a privateer in corporate clothing. It was a brawler, a swashbuckler. Its charter practically demanded that it attack Spanish silver fleets and raid Portuguese sugar plantations. It was a state-sanctioned pirate with shareholders. Its story is not one of spices, but of sugar, slaves, and the brutal, bloody birth of an empire in the Americas. To understand the Dutch Golden Age, we must understand both companies. To focus only on the celebrated VOC is to see only half the picture. The WIC's tale is messier, more violent, and ultimately less successful, but it is just as crucial. It reveals the raw ambition of a small nation determined to become a world power. It shows how the Dutch projected their fight for independence onto a global stage. The WIC's journey into the Atlantic was a bold and often brutal gamble to build a different kind of empire, one forged in the crucible of war and colonization, leaving a complex and painful legacy that still echoes today. The story of the WIC begins with the end of a peace. For 12 years, from 1609 to 1621, a fragile truce had silenced the guns between the Dutch Republic and its old master, Spain. This was the 12 Years' Truce. It was a much-needed pause in the 80 Years' War, the long, grueling Dutch struggle for independence. During this lull, the Netherlands flourished. Its merchants, freed from the constant threat of Spanish warships, expanded their trade networks across the globe. Amsterdam became the bustling heart of a new kind of commercial empire, a city built on capital, credit, and an unshakable belief in the power of profit. But peace was never going to last. The truce was a compromise, not a solution. Spain had never truly accepted the independence of its rebellious northern provinces. The Dutch, for their part, had grown bolder and more ambitious. They had tasted the fruits of global trade and wanted more. Within the Dutch Republic, two factions argued over the future. On one side were the moderates, who favored peace and stable commerce. They were content with the riches flowing from the VOC in the east and saw no need to provoke the Spanish bear in its Atlantic den. They feared that renewed war would disrupt trade and drain the nation's treasury. Opposing them was a powerful war party. These were staunch Calvinists, fiery patriots, and shrewd investors who saw renewed conflict not as a threat, but as an opportunity. They believed that the Dutch Republic's destiny was to break the global dominance of Catholic Spain and Portugal. To them, the truce was a sign of weakness. They argued that true independence could only be won on the battlefield, and that the battlefield was now the entire world. They looked west, to the Americas and Africa, and saw a vast theater of operations where the war against Spain could be fought at a profit. These men were not just patriots.
They were capitalists with a vision. When the truce expired in 1621, the war party got its wish. The cannons began to roar once more. But this was not just a resumption of the old European conflict. The war had gone global. The Dutch had learned a valuable lesson from the VOC, a chartered company, backed by the state, but powered by private investment, could be a formidable weapon. It could wage war, administer territories, and generate wealth all at the same time. The decision was made. The time had come to create a new company, a sister to the VOC, designed specifically to take the fight to the Spanish and Portuguese in their own backyard, the Atlantic.
The Dutch West India Company was officially born on June 3, 1621. On that day, the States General, the government of the Dutch Republic, granted it a 24-year charter. This was no ordinary business license. It was a declaration of economic and military war. The charter gave the WIC a massive monopoly. It had the exclusive right to trade, colonize, and wage war in a vast domain stretching across the Atlantic. This included the entire coast of the Americas, from the northernmost reaches of Canada down to the Strait of Magellan, as well as the western coast of Africa, from the Tropic of Cancer to the Cape of Good Hope. It was an empire on paper, waiting to be conquered. The company's structure was a marvel of 17th century corporate engineering, modeled closely on its successful eastern sibling, the VOC. Power was decentralized. The WIC was divided into 5 regional chambers, based in the key port cities of Media Group, aerials or paintings of Amsterdam Port, Zeeland Harbor, Rotterdam Historic Port, West Friesland Town, Groningen Cityscape Stock, distribute equally. Amsterdam, Zeeland, Rotterdam, the Noorderkwartier, West Friesland, and Groningen. Each chamber was responsible for raising its own capital, building its own ships, and recruiting its own soldiers and sailors. This structure harnessed local pride and investment, turning the entire coastal region of the Netherlands into a stakeholder in the Atlantic enterprise. It was a way of mobilizing the nation's resources for a single aggressive purpose. Overseeing these chambers was a central board of directors known as the Heren 19, or the 19 Gentlemen. This council was the company's brain. It set the grand strategy, allocated resources, and made the critical decisions about Media Group, 17th century maps with strategic locations, Dutch ships sailing to colonies, Dutch settlements in New World to stock or distribute equally, where to attack, where to trade, and where to build settlements. The government was deeply involved. The States General appointed one of the 19 directors and pledged a subsidy of 1 million guilders. It also promised to provide soldiers and warships to assist the company's military operations. This was a true public-private partnership, a fusion of state power and commercial ambition. The promise held out to investors was irresistible. They were invited not just to fund a trading venture, but to buy shares in a patriotic crusade. Prospectuses and pamphlets trumpeted the twin goals of Media Group, historic pamphlet with Dutch-Spanish conflict, illustration of Spanish treasure, period text on profits, to stock or distribute equally, crippling the Spanish army, and reaping enormous profits. The WIC was a joint stock company, meaning anyone with a little extra cash could buy a piece of the action. People from all walks of life, merchants, artisans, widows, and clergymen, poured their savings into the new enterprise. They were betting on the company's ability to Media Group, Dutch soldiers attacking Spanish silver shipment, sugar plantation in Brazil, Dutch ship landing in New World WIC stocking, distribute equally, seize Spanish silver, conquer Portuguese sugar plantations, and establish a Dutch presence in the New World. The WIC was born, a hybrid creature of capital and cannon. From its very inception, the Dutch West India Company was designed for a purpose that went far beyond simple trade. While the VOC's motto could have been trade at all costs, the WIC's was closer to war for profit. Its charter explicitly authorized it to attack and conquer the ships and territories of Spain and Portugal. The company was empowered to build forts, appoint governors, administer justice, and sign treaties with local rulers. It was, in effect, a sovereign state operating in the Atlantic, a branch of the Dutch government outsourced to a board of directors. Every trading post was a fortress, and every merchant ship was armed for a fight. This blend of commerce and conflict was a radical idea. In the 17th century, war was traditionally the business of kings and states, funded by taxes. The WIC turned war into a business venture. Its shareholders were investing in military campaigns. The potential returns were spectacular. A single captured Spanish silver fleet could pay a dividend that would make investors rich overnight. The conquest of a sugar-producing region in Brazil could provide a steady stream of income for decades. This was the core of the WIC's business model: use organized violence to seize control of the most valuable economic assets in the Atlantic world. The company's first major actions were military, not commercial. It sent fleets to raid the coast of Brazil, to attack Spanish ports in the Caribbean, and to establish a foothold on the coast of West Africa. One of its earliest and most ambitious projects was the Grand Design. This was a massive, coordinated plan to launch simultaneous attacks on the key centers of Iberian power. Salvador da Bahia in Brazil, the heart of the Portuguese sugar industry, and Luanda in Angola, the main source of enslaved Africans for the Brazilian plantations. The goal was to decapitate the Portuguese Atlantic Empire and seize its most profitable components in a single, decisive blow. This militaristic approach set the WIC apart from any trading company that had come before it. It was not a group of merchants seeking peaceful exchange. It was an instrument of national policy, a tool for empire building. The men who ran the WIC and sailed on its ships were a mix of soldiers, sailors, privateers, and administrators. They saw no contradiction between flying the company flag and fighting for the Dutch Republic. For them, business and battle were two sides of the same coin. They were there to make money for the shareholders and to hurt the enemy, and they believed that the best way to do one was by doing the other. The Atlantic world of the early 17th century was a treasure chest, and Spain and Portugal held the keys. The Dutch West India Company was forged to break the lock. The directors of the Heron 19 saw a landscape rich with opportunities, a map of potential profits just waiting to be claimed. The most glittering prize was Spanish silver. Each year, massive treasure fleets, or flotas, sailed from the Americas to Seville, laden with silver mined from the mountains of Peru and Mexico. This silver was, honestly, the lifeblood of the Spanish war machine. Capturing a single fleet would not only enrich the WIC's shareholders, but would also deal a devastating blow to the Spanish king's ability to pay his armies in Europe. Another more permanent source of wealth was sugar. The Portuguese had turned the northeast coast of Brazil into the world's leading producer of this so-called white gold. Vast plantations, worked by the forced labor of enslaved Africans and indigenous people, generated immense fortunes. The WIC saw an opportunity to seize this ready-made industry. By conquering the sugar regions of Pernambuco, the company could take control of the entire production chain, from the cultivation of sugarcane in Brazil to its refinement and sale in Amsterdam. This was not just a raid for plunder, it was a plan for long-term colonial exploitation, a way to build a permanent and profitable Dutch Brazil. Beyond sugar and silver, the Atlantic offered other valuable commodities. In the Caribbean and North America, tobacco was becoming a popular and profitable crop. Farmers from the Hudson River Valley, where the WIC established its colony of New Netherland, were also in high demand in Europe. The company planned to control these trades, establishing fleets and trading posts to monopolize the flow of goods. But the most significant commodity that made it independent from the Atlantic system was human beings. The sugar plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean were hungry for labor, and the The WIC's ambitions were nothing short of breathtaking. The company's leadership did not think in terms of isolated raids or small trading posts. They envisioned a coherent, interconnected Dutch empire spanning the entire Atlantic. This was the grand design, or as we say, a strategic masterpiece of staggering scale and complexity. It was a plan to break the Iberian monopoly in the Atlantic once and for all by attacking its strongest points and seizing its most valuable assets. The goal was to create a self-sustaining system of colonies and trade routes that would enrich the Netherlands and permanently cripple its enemies, Spain and Portugal. The first part of the plan targeted Brazil. In 1624, a large WIC fleet attacked and captured Salvador da Bahia, the capital of Portuguese Brazil. Although the Dutch were driven out a year later, the attack sent shockwaves through the Iberian world. It was a clear statement of intent. The WIC returned in 1630, this time targeting the richer and less defended region of Pernambuco. This time, they succeeded. They captured the cities of Olinda and Recife and began the long, bloody process of conquering the sugar-producing interior. For a time, it seemed the dream of a Dutch Brazil, a vast agricultural colony pouring wealth into Amsterdam, was within reach. The second part of the grand design focused on Africa. The Brazilian sugar economy depended entirely on a constant supply of enslaved labor from Angola. The WIC strategists reasoned that if they could capture the main Portuguese slave trading port of Luanda, they would control the spigot. They could cut off the labor supply to the parts of Brazil still under Portuguese control and direct the flow of enslaved people to their own new sugar colony. In 1641, a WIC fleet crossed the Atlantic from Dutch Brazil and successfully captured Luanda. For a few years, the WIC controlled both the center of sugar production and the primary source of its labor. The third and most famous element of the strategy was the hunt for Spanish silver. This was the job of the company's privateers, the sea wolves of the Caribbean. For years, they hunted the Spanish treasure fleets with little success. Then, in 1628, came the moment of glory. Admiral Piet Hein, one of the WIC's most brilliant and ruthless commanders, cornered the Spanish silver fleet in Matanzas Bay, off the coast of Cuba. He captured the entire fleet without a major fight. The haul was astronomical, valued at over 11 million guilders. It was one of the greatest heists in history. The captured treasure was enough to fund the Dutch army for 8 months and pay the WIC's shareholders a staggering 50% dividend. The appeal of the Dutch West India Company was powerful because it spoke to two of the deepest motivations of the 17th century Dutchman: faith and finance. The company masterfully blended the language of holy war with the promise of earthly riches. In pamphlets, sermons, and public announcements, the struggle against Spain and Portugal was portrayed as more than just a political conflict. It was a righteous crusade. It was a fight for the survival of the true Protestant religion against the tyranny of the Catholic Spanish Inquisition. Every cannonball fired at a Spanish galleon was a blow for religious freedom. This patriotic and religious fervor was a potent recruiting tool and a powerful justification for the company's aggressive actions. The directors of the WIC, the Heren 19th, were often devout Calvinists who genuinely believed they were doing God's work. They saw the Catholic Iberian empires as corrupt, decadent, and idolatrous. By attacking them, they were not only serving the interests of the Dutch Republic, but also advancing the cause of Protestantism. This belief system helped to legitimize the violence and exploitation that were central to the company's operations. Conquering Brazil or capturing a silver fleet was framed as a victory for God, as well as for the shareholders. At the same time, the WIC was an unapologetically commercial enterprise. Its primary legal duty was to generate a return for its investors. The company's directors were merchants and financiers, men who understood the language of balance sheets and profit margins. They knew that patriotism alone would not keep the company afloat. The immense costs of building ships, hiring soldiers, and mounting expeditions had to be covered by profits. The capture of Piet Hein's silver fleet in 1628
was the perfect embodiment of this dual identity. It was a great patriotic victory that humiliated the Spanish king, and it produced a massive financial windfall that delighted the investors back in Amsterdam. This fusion of piety and profit created a unique and formidable corporate culture. A WIC employee, whether he was a governor in New Netherland, a soldier in Brazil, or a trader in Africa, served two masters. He was an agent of the Dutch state and a servant of the company's shareholders. His duty was to expand the power of the Republic and to find new sources of revenue. This could lead to incredible acts of bravery and ingenuity. But it also created a system where moral compromises were easy to make. When the profits from the slave trade proved too great to ignore, religious objections were quietly set aside. In the world of the WIC, God and Mammon walked hand in hand.
The Dutch West India Company was more than just a company. It was a grand and audacious experiment. It was an attempt to build a new kind of empire, one that was not commanded by a king, but directed by a board of executives. It was an empire funded not by royal treasuries, but by the pooled capital of thousands of private citizens. The WIC was a laboratory for a new model of colonialism, one that sought to integrate warfare, colonization, and commerce into a single, profitable enterprise. The Atlantic Ocean was its crucible, a place where these volatile elements were mixed together in a fiery and often explosive combination. This experiment was a departure from the past. Traditional empires were built by conquest and held by military force. The WIC tried to build an empire on a business plan. Its colonies, like New Netherland in North America and Dutch Brazil, were not just territorial possessions. They were assets on a corporate balance sheet. They were expected to generate revenue. The governors of these colonies were essentially branch managers, responsible for controlling costs and maximizing returns. This corporate logic shaped every aspect of colonial life, from relations with indigenous peoples to the administration of justice. The bottom line was always a primary concern. However, the experiment proved to be incredibly difficult and ultimately unsustainable. The WIC discovered that running an empire was far more expensive and complicated than running a trading post. The costs of war were immense. The company had to maintain fleets, pay soldiers, and build fortifications across a vast and hostile territory. These costs constantly ate into any profits made from trade or plunder. The conquest of Brazil, for example, turned into a long, draining guerrilla war against Portuguese settlers that consumed the company's resources. The WIC was constantly struggling with a cash flow crisis, borrowing heavily to fund its military ambitions. Furthermore, the company found it difficult to reconcile its competing goals. The demands of war often conflicted with the needs of commerce. A focus on short-term profits from privateering and plunder distracted from the long-term investment needed to build stable, productive colonies. The company was pulled in too many directions at once. It was trying to be a navy, an army, a government, and a trading firm all at the same time. The structure that had seemed so brilliant on paper proved to be unwieldy in practice. The WIC's bold experiment in corporate empire building was slowly buckling under the weight of its own contradictions. The story of the Dutch West India Company is not a simple tale of success or failure. Its grand ambitions were never fully realized. Dutch Brazil was lost, retaken by the Portuguese in 1654. New Netherland was seized by the English a decade later and renamed New York. The company was plagued by debt for most of its existence and was eventually dissolved. Judged by the standards of its celebrated sibling, the VOC, the WIC was a financial disappointment. It failed to create the lasting, profitable Atlantic empire that its founders had so confidently envisioned. It remains the lesser-known twin, overshadowed by the glittering success of the Eastern Company. Yet, the WIC left a deep and enduring mark on the world. Its legacy is one of bold ambition and brutal consequence. For a few decades, this Dutch company was a dominant power in the Atlantic. It challenged the might of Spain and Portugal, projected Dutch power across the ocean, and reshaped the geopolitical map of the Americas and Africa. It founded colonies that, while short-lived under Dutch rule, would grow into major centers of global importance. The WIC's trading post on Manhattan Island laid the foundation for the city of New York. Its brief but intense rule in Brazil transformed the sugar industry and the slave trade. The company's most controversial and painful legacy is its deep involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. The WIC became one of the most significant slave trading entities of the 17th century. It industrialized the transport of enslaved Africans, treating human beings as cargo to be shipped and sold for profit. The forts it captured and operated on the African coast, like Elmina Castle, became sites of immense human suffering. The agony of the millions of people captured, branded, and forced onto the company's ships is an inseparable part of the WIC's history. This dark chapter complicates any celebration of the company's commercial or military achievements. Ultimately, the Dutch West India Company stands as a powerful symbol of the Dutch Golden Age's dual nature. It represents the incredible energy, innovation, and global ambition of a small nation that dared to challenge the world's superpowers. But it also represents the profound moral compromises and human costs that were entangled with that ambition. The WIC was an experiment in building an empire through a combination of war and business, a bold and often ruthless venture that forever changed the Atlantic world. Its story is a necessary and sobering reminder that the foundations of our modern world were often laid with both brilliance and brutality.